Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's Germination Retail Roundtable webinar. My name is Mark Zinkowitz, and I serve as editor for Germination, and today I am happy to be your host. Today, the theme is navigating the world of global trade. We'll hear from 4 experts who will offer us some knowledge and a little advice on how we as an industry can work through the trade-related issues that impact everybody. First, I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors, 2020 Seed Labs, Canterra Seeds, and CCAN for their support. We'll be doing some live tweeting during the proceedings. I encourage you to engage with us on Twitter by following the hashtag #SeedRetail as we go along. During the presentation, you'll no doubt have some questions for our speakers. Please type these into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we'll address them during the Q&A sessions that we'll hold after each speaker finishes their presentation. Also, today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available at germination.ca following the event. Now, this fellow here looks a little bit anxious, like many of us do when trade disruptions make headlines, which seems to be happening on a daily basis. With so much out of our control as individuals when it comes to trade, our best defense against these seemingly daily disruptions is to arm ourselves with knowledge so that we can understand that trade disruptions are nothing new, they happen all the time. And if we have knowledge, if we think about them the right way, we can successfully come out the other side. Again, questions are welcomed, so when you have one, just type it into the chat box, please. Our first speaker today is Michelle Klieger. She's president for Stratagerm Consulting based in Boston, Massachusetts. Michelle comes from a trade association role. She's familiar with the key players in the U.S. and international seed industry. During her career, she's worked on 6 continents, helping industry leaders move seed varieties globally and also grow their businesses. Michelle's going to talk about some high-level trade issues that affect the North American seed industry and how you can cope with them. Take it away, Michelle.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I think this is going to be a great session, and I'm excited to learn from the other speakers. So in my presentation, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview on the current trade situation, how companies can help address major trade disruptions, a few seed-specific concerns to watch. That will definitely be the focus, and then how to address the concerns that we've identified. So right now, I would say overall, we've transitioned from a global environment of declining tariffs and increasing free trade agreements to a much more protectionist time. Most people would point to the Brexit vote in the UK, as well as the election of Donald Trump in the United States, as 2 of the flagstone events showing this transition. And the policies that Trump ushered in were very specific. He took very specific actions, starting with steel and aluminum tariffs that impacted a lot of U.S. allies, as well as competitors, and this also directly impacted Canada. He also decided to renegotiate free trade agreements like NAFTA with the United States, Canada, and Mexico, as well as KORUS, which is the Korean-U.S. free trade agreement. And he's also made statements against multilateral bodies like the World Trade Organization. So while we've seen a huge shift in the United States towards more protectionist policies, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, talks with the European Union on a free trade agreement have really stalled. In Canada, we've seen much more of a staying the course. In 2018, Canada finalized 2 significant multilateral agreements, and that is one with the European Union and the other, the revised Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnerships. and that covers 10 countries in the Pacific Rim, totaling about 40% of global GDP. Next slide. So looking at now that we have a general overview of trade and that it's basically becoming more difficult, I want to focus on why trade is so important for the seed industry. We generally talk about seed movement because a seed and its genetics could pass through 6 countries before it's planted by a farmer. And so this happens in a number of different ways. You have counter-seasonal production. You have pre-commercialization research and production. So this might be trialing varieties in different countries or climates. It might be moving parent lines around and multiplying seeds. And then finally, you do have commercial sales, which can cross borders. So for all of these reasons, it's important for seed companies to be able to know where the tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade are. Every time a seed crosses a border, it could be hit with a tariff or which is expensive, or it might face non-tariff barriers to trade, which would slow things down. So if shipments are getting rejected or delays, you're missing planting windows, and it could slow down the amount of time it takes or increase the amount of time it takes for a variety to come to market, which has a negative impact on the farming community as a whole. So the best way to cope with trade disruptions is to maximize the amount of information you have and maximum amount of time you have to address the concerns that you've established. So you'll want to understand how a tariff could impact your business. Then you want to figure out how to insulate yourself from the negative impacts. This could be higher costs of goods or supply chain shortages. Then you'll want to prepare yourself and act as quickly as possible. We're seeing, especially in the United States, that the turnaround time on new tariffs is extremely short. Last week, President Trump announced, potentially new tariffs on Chinese goods coming that are imported. And the announcement came out last night, less than a week later, for public comments. The public comments is 60 days, and then the tariffs can go into effect. So when you're thinking about your supply chain, 60 days to rework everything, maybe a few more months than that, is not a lot of time. So the earlier you can get started and thinking about those options, the more time you have to make changes and potentially the more options you'll have. As it gets closer and closer to the implementation date, your competitors have probably started to think about it too. And, new production facilities, shipping or storage, we've seen a major increase in all of those prices in the last year. And how the tariffs impact your business really varies from industry to industry. And that's why I want to spend most of my presentation talking about how these disruptions will directly affect the seed industry. So we're going to look at 3 separate places that seed companies should be concerned about. So there's higher prices of seeds. There are lower commodity trade, so there'd be less demand for seeds, and lower commodity prices. So companies aren't really willing to invest as much in their value add to their seeds. So better genetics, better seed treatments, other added costs that are on the seeds. So when we look at higher prices, a lot of this is focused on the vegetable seed industry. Vegetable seed multiplication, a lot of it is done in China because it is labor intensive. So this aims to reduce production costs. These contracts have also been in place in China for over 30 years with a lot of companies. So there is a lot of regional and institutional knowledge that's been built in. So it's not so easy to just move to another country. And the vegetable seeds that come from China and are brought to the United States to be cleaned, processed, and sold potentially to Canadian growers, they all face a 25% tariff starting last Friday. So this tariff was 10% since last September, and starting on May 10th, it jumped to 25%. For the flower seed industry, a lot of flower seeds are multiplied in China because Chinese farmers are willing to contract very small amounts, roughly half a mu, which is about 3,000 square feet. So finding growers in other parts of the world that are willing to sign a contract for such a small quantity is difficult, and therefore another reason why moving flower seed production out of China may be challenging. On the row crop and grass seed sectors, those aren't grown in China, and so they're less likely to be affected by tariffs. Row crop production is mechanical, so you don't need that labor intensive. You don't need those reduced labor costs. And grass seed are almost exclusively grown in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. So I pulled together this data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, looking at Canadian seed imports from the United States. So you'll see on the top one is 2017 and 2018. There's actually an increase year over year in total seed imports, but there is an almost 10% reduction in vegetable seed imports. And the vegetable seeds are the one that had that 10% higher tariff on it. And then looking at the data that's available for the first quarter of 2018 and 19, you'll see that the decline is actually significant in both total seed imports from the United States to Canada, as well as vegetable seed imports are down almost $1 million, which is roughly 8%. So in just the last 6 months, we've seen a big shift in how vegetable seeds are moving. Some of this might be on the seed side where they're trying to avoid the tariffs, so they're shipping directly to Canada, or intermediaries might be the European Union. And some of it might be just less demand for seed in vegetable seed in general, as people figure out how to absorb the costs and change their businesses. So when you're talking about agricultural commodities, so the actual grain and outputs, they're priced globally. And so there are a lot of factors that affect price. This includes global weather patterns, domestic policies, which could be tariffs, but also regulations, and international policies like free trade agreements. So so this affects the seed industry because when crop prices go down, generally the acreage will follow. It's not as profitable for a grower to be in that crop, so they might change to something else. And when crop prices increase, the acreage tends to increase. My whole presentation is not bad news. There are places where we are seeing shifts to certain crops are actually benefiting from the current trade environment. And these changes in planted acres do affect what people are demanding. And so as seed retailers or seed producers, you want to be able to meet the demand and not have surplus that you're holding on to. So that's why looking at commodity prices could help shift your business. So there are some places where we're seeing a lower demand for certain seeds. When markets abruptly close, there might be a surplus of the grain. So when you look specifically at canola and lentil acres in Canada, Statistics Canada is expecting a decline in acreage for both of these crops because of the Chinese have stopped purchasing canola from Canada, meaning that there's a surplus of Canadian canola, depressing prices. And India has stopped purchasing lentils as of last July, and there are also very large stocks of these. So in the 2019 marketing year, there will be lower acreage of both canola and lentils as farmers shift towards other crops. And in the United States, the Department of Agriculture is projecting lower soybean acreage for the same reason. China isn't purchasing U.S. soybeans, and that is depressing their value. On the other side, there are some crops that have done very well, and we would expect to see larger acreage in 2019. So Canadian wheat exports have increased by 167%, and that largely is due to a drop in U.S. wheat exports to China. So there's been a shift in where China's buying from, increasing wheat acreage in Canada, decreasing in the United States. And similar in barley, there's a higher demand for barley from the Chinese as well as the Japanese. With the new Trans-Pacific Partnership, the tariff on barley going to Japan will be 45% instead of 255%. So you could see higher exports and a higher demand for barley. And this is a a table of planted acreage over the last 3 years. And the final column shows you the change between 2018 and 2019. I really don't want to belabor this point. The presentation is available for replay, and my slides will be available to everybody that's interested in them, so you can look over this in your own time. And the last behavior that would affect seed companies or seed treatment companies is a lower willingness to pay. So lower grain prices will change growers' behaviors. When grain prices are high, growers are willing to invest money into inputs because they want to maximize their yield so they can sell as much at that higher price. That means they might be able to buy better genetics or seed treatments or biologicals. When commodity prices are lower, they're trying to minimize their costs, and the concern really isn't to maximize their yield. So in the current trade environment, if there are lower commodity prices, you're going to see a lower willingness to pay, and this will affect margins and profitability of seed companies and associated technologies. So as you think through your business and which of these concerns does affect you, you can start to ask questions about your business and model the impact of the changes. So understanding what your key markets are, where are your risks, and what happens if they close, as well as are you prepared for upside? In the examples of wheat and barley, are you prepared to sell more of those seeds? And one of the nice things, I guess, is that as a silver lining, that the trade disruptions or war has been going on for about a year now. So we're beginning to have data to really model. So we saw that tariff on vegetable seed last year was 10%, and it's already dropped demand. So, when you more than double that, how will that affect vegetable seed sales? But this situation really is constant. There has been a ton of news on trade just this week. And so really trying to stay up to speed on the changes is the best way to stay ahead of the curve. So thank you very much. I hope you found this information helpful. Here's my contact information. And as I said, the slides and a summary one-page graphic are available on my website. So thank you. And are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Michelle. I do have some questions. First question, referring to the change in vegetable seed imports into Canada. And again, I just want to remind our audience, if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Regarding the change in vegetable seed imports into Canada, is that change just part of a cycle, or does it match historical trends?
It doesn't appear to be part of a cycle. I would say that I looked at the last few years, and the the trend really has been to have larger imports year over year. There haven't really been major decreases. That being said, I would say that in 2018, 2017, 18, and 19, there are some temporary disruptions that have affected the data. When talks of NAFTA renegotiation started, there was a earlier purchasing of available seeds to get in before any tariffs. And the same thing has happened last year before the September tariffs went in with the Chinese goods. You saw a spike in buying that helped normalize the year, which is why I think that the first quarter numbers are so significant, because you've bought out everything before the price increases, and you're now looking at, in the current conditions. But if I can show someone how to get that data if we want to look at it more specifically.
I have a two-part question, Michelle. Which alternative markets are stepping up to absorb the reduced imports from China? And second part of this question, do you see much higher cost associated with moving to those alternative markets?
There are some, companies are looking at other markets within Southeast Asia, trying to keep labor costs down and not move their supply chain as much. So I've worked with the Asia Pacific Seed Association, and like a lot of sectors, you will see, I do think that you're seeing a transition to production and multiplication in countries like Vietnam and Thailand. They still have reasonable labor costs. They have adopted or are transitioning into UPOV 91, so that seed companies still get that protection they need. South Korea is also looking at being a seed hub. So there is some movement, but those countries, you would have to still file paperwork to move your seeds in if they're not used to dealing with research quantities. It'll take some education. So I do think that you will see a transition out of Canada, especially now that it seems that the tariffs are pretty permanent. It does make sense for companies to invest. I've also spoken with other companies that are looking at Central and South America, so moving it much closer to home. But they have some experience in those countries. There's already counter-seasonal production going on. So yes, I think there will be a transition. I just think it's not going to be tomorrow, and it's not quite as easy as picking up and moving.
When a country boycotts a commodity from another country, does it drive prices higher in other markets, or does the market self-adjust?
So it depends on the commodity, I would say. A lot of, political voices in the United States have made that argument that if China doesn't buy American soybeans, then they're going to have to buy Brazilians, and whoever Brazil sold to, America can sell to them instead. So on some level, it makes sense that all of the supply chains would just move around. I don't think in practice it ever works that smoothly. In that example, the United States and Canada are producing in opposite seasons. The United States and Brazil are producing in opposite seasons. So they are rarely selling soybeans at the same time of year, which affects price. But I guess a second point would be, you never know about the weather. So with the Canadian canola into into China, China stopped buying Canadian canola, and Australia was going to fill in a lot of the demand, and then Australia had a bad year. So that would cause prices to increase for global canola, even though it might depress prices still in Canada. And the third thing is that markets just don't like uncertainty. And so if you have contracts in place or ships on the water, and then there's suddenly a closed market, you have to figure out what to do with that ship. It could be a loss of that unit. You might have to find a new producer. That takes time. How much competition is it? So even if everything does find a new home for a reasonable price, there's still that interruption, and you'll still see spikes in the future. So it could all work out, but it's never exactly the same as markets getting to pick the best fit for them.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. I'd like to introduce our second speaker. Brian Innes is Vice President Public Affairs for the Canola Council of Canada. He joined the Canola Council in 2011 as Market Access Manager, a role in which he concentrated on market access and government relations with a focus on international trade. He's also President of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance. And Brian is going to update us on the current situation between China and Canada in regard to canola and some lessons learned along the way that everybody can benefit from. Brian, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for the invitation to join you today and to share a little bit about what we know on the situation with China. I'll have about 10 minutes worth of remarks, and then hopefully we can get into some questions for the remaining 5 minutes. If we can move to the first slide, Mark, what we want to talk about here today is really what the situation currently is for our canola exports to China, how China has become such a large market for us, and then finish by describing some of the things that we've learned. You can see on the slide in front of you some of the core funders of the Canola Council. Many of those core funders are seed developers, and then, of course, we have members as well, including Canterra Seeds, who's sponsoring today's webinar. The slide in front of you there now shows how Canada is a world leader in canola production. You can see there that when it comes to canola, Canada really is the source of most of the world's canola. And you can see there that roughly 70% of all the canola traded in the world comes from Canada, whether that's canola seed or canola oil or canola meal. And that means when it comes to our export markets, because over 90% of our canola is exported in one way, shape, or form. Mark, we're getting some comments how there's no sound. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes. If you're having any audio issues, please try logging back into the webinar, and that should resolve it. Go ahead, Brian. Yeah, feel free to go ahead, Brian. My apologies.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So when we move on to the next slide, Mark, we can see that 90% of the canola grown in Canada is exported as oil or seed or as meal. And so as a country, we're really focused around exports in canola, and we're really focused around how we can maintain stable access to our export markets. Moving on to the next slide, Mark, which is the pie graph, you will see that although we export more than 90%, a lot of our exports are concentrated in 4 major markets, the 4 major markets being China, the US, Japan, and Mexico. And so when we look at our export profile, those customers are very important, and we spend a lot of time trying to ensure we have stable relations across those major 4 markets. Today's webinar is really about China. So, Mark, if we can go on to the 6th slide, we're a couple slides behind here. what we're looking at here is China as a significant market for Canadian canola. It's been a very important market for us because there's been very strong demand in China for the things that canola produces, whether that's oil for humans or protein for livestock. Canola is a great fit in the Chinese culture, and so it's been very strong demand for us, taking about 40% of all of our canola seed oil and meal exports. Our slides seem to have stopped progressing. Mark, if you were able to move them forward, that would be helpful. I'm going to move on to what we've been focusing on in China for many, many years, which is building long-term relationships. As a Canola Council, our efforts in China have been focused around long-term relationships, and these go back many, many years, whether it was starting in 2009 in our discussions with China around blackleg, continuing in 2013 and 2016, investing in research together with the Chinese over the last decade, investing in research to show them how canola meal can work in dairy rations and improve productivity in China. We've been investing on the ground in China for many years, including with partners such as industry associations like the Canola Council. What you'll see, hopefully, if we get the slide advanced, there are some pictures that I've shared of some of our experiences there. One such picture actually includes our president shaking hands with the president of the China National Foodstuffs Association and the Minister of Agriculture. And of course, right in the background is the same individual who's now in charge of the quarantine inspection for plants, and it's very relevant in our current discussions with China. So this is a good point to transition into our current situation and what we're facing and what we're doing about it. I'm sure if most folks have heard about canola and the situation we have with China, what's happened for us is that we've had two exporters that have had their license suspended. This is Richardson and Viterra, and then all importers of canola seed are reluctant to buy. So we're essentially not seeing canola seed exports move from Canada to China. At the same time, we're monitoring very closely our oil exports, which continue to flow, but like many Canadian agri-food exports, do face some reluctance from the Chinese buyers given the current uncertainty. And canola meal exports continue to go. So moving on to slide number 9, this entitled Addressing the Problem. What we're doing as an industry through the Canola Working Group involving federal and provincial governments is working on first regaining the access to China for our seed, and second, focusing on market diversification, and third, looking at supporting our producers through this time of uncertainty. So there are a number of things as part of this working group that we are advancing. It's very important that we think about how to best support the industry in this time of incredible uncertainty. We're very aware that farmers right now are going to the field and planting more than $1.2 billion worth of canola seed. We're very aware of that. That's just part of what farmers are investing in this year's crop, and there's a lot of uncertainty about where this year's crop will go and what it will be worth when farmers harvest. Not to mention the large canola stocks that we have as well. So now I'd like to finish the presentation to cover some best practices that we've learned in working with China. The best practices that we've learned really focus around three things. The first one being that relationships are critical in market access issues and dealing with other governments. Second of which is how industry leadership is so essential and is very required to get a outcome that is beneficial. And third, how a strategy really requires long-term horizons. So I'll speak just briefly about each of these. So the first one around relationships being critical. This is especially important in Asia and China itself. And it's important because the first step in understanding what we can do about a problem is to understand what's going on. And to do that, we need to understand who's involved and why they're involved, whether it's on the government side or on the industry side. And we need to understand from the industry perspective, what are the things that the industry is facing in China, or our customers' perspective, and why? And gathering that intelligence really helps us to understand better what's happening and why it's happening, and form an appropriate strategy to deal with it. The second best practice that we've seen, both in this issue with China as well as what's happened over a number of years in market access, is that leadership from industry is very, very critical. And I'll give you an example where in industry, whether it's farmers or the seed industry or the export community or the broad agricultural industry, has a lot of different views at times. There's an old joke that if you've got 5 farmers in a room, you'll have 10 opinions. And with 43,000 canola farmers, I'm sure you can appreciate that that means there's a lot of different viewpoints out there. Well, the same thing with seed companies, the same thing with processors and exporters. The challenge that would happen, of course, is if you had all those voices going to the one organization who can talk to the government of China, being the government of Canada, that you've got a lot of voices and not a lot of priorities. So when I say industry leadership, what it means is taking leadership to have a consensus viewpoint that we can advance on behalf of the industry, and then also making sure that industry is involved very closely with government to ensure that any solution that we achieve is a valuable one, a valuable solution for all involved, and a valuable solution for those at the table. So lastly, I want to conclude just by this last best practice around strategy requiring a long-term horizon. And this has been really informative for us working with the Chinese. There's an old Chinese expression that says, an agreement is a pause in the negotiations. An agreement is a pause in the negotiations. So when thinking to the previous question on the webinar around stability and what happens over time and what we should do about it, I think what we look at is what's happening from the fundamental demand perspective for our products. How are we trying to meet the demand of our customers, even though we're facing some very significant short-term uncertainty? So with that, I'll finish, Mark, and open the line for questions. I hope you found it interesting. And I was thinking that I was going to announce that we solved our situation with China overnight, but unfortunately I wasn't able to deliver that today. But we're still working hard on that on behalf of the industry at the Canola Council, and hope to be able to share good news when it arrives as we continue to work on the situation.
That would have been great, Brian. You heard it here first on the Germination webinar that the canola situation with China has been solved, but maybe next time. But thanks so much for your time. We'll do a quick Q&A session with Brian now. Again, if you have a question, please just type it in. Brian, what can the seed industry do specifically to help in this matter?
Yeah, thank you. Well, one thing that we're seeing is that it's important that industry in China hear from others around how it's affecting their business relationships. Many in the seed industry have counterparts in China. Many in the seed industry have counterparts in other countries or at multiple levels of the supply chain. And so helping our Chinese counterparts understand the impact of of the current situation, I think, is very helpful. I think domestically too, what we've seen happen in Canada is a real coming together of the whole value chain and rallying around a sector that's really seeing some significant uncertainty. And so the seed industry is certainly part of that, but growers are affected by it, and so is everyone else in the industry. So maintaining support for those in suffering from the uncertainty, as well as banding together and seeing this as a collective problem, I think are both helpful.
Do seed growers and plant breeders have to be concerned about this long term?
Well, what I see is that the demand in China hasn't changed overnight, and the way our customers see our product hasn't changed either. What we're seeing is a disruption, but it hasn't been caused by a shift in market fundamentals or a shift in relationships with our customers and our product. So the fundamentals remain strong. I think that the previous speaker covered how uncertainty in the international environment is affecting us all, and that's what we're seeing in canola. So I wouldn't say that our canola situation presents a risk that's detrimental to our future, but just to say that this uncertainty is affecting us and how we do our business going forward.
As you know, Brian, China has said that there are some sanitary issues related to Canadian canola. That's why it has stopped accepting imports. Has the canola pest in question ever actually been officially named by China?
Yes, the pests that China has identified as ones of quarantine significance have been named publicly in their notices on their website and in the notices that they have sent to Canada. There have been 5 weeds identified, 5 weeds that have had where there's been seeds in our shipments, or they allege there have been weeds in our shipments, and 2 pathogens, one of which is blackleg.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for taking part today. We really appreciate your time. Going to move on to our third speaker of the day. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your time with us today, your lunch hour. We really appreciate it. We're just going to switch gears for a moment. Mike Scheffel is Managing Director of Policy and Standards for the Canadian Seed Growers Association, and he's going to really focus in not on the international trade scene so much, but talk briefly about the importance of understanding variety registration here in Canada and how understanding it can help people avoid many pitfalls they can sometimes experience when trying to sell seed here. Take it away, Mike.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, and good day, everyone. I'm pleased to be able to participate in this session today, and congratulations to Mark and Germination for organizing it. Today I'm speaking about the commercialization of new varieties in Canada, and to illustrate the various and varying requirements, I'll be using soybeans and industrial hemp as examples, but I'm certainly willing to answer any questions as they may relate to other crop kinds as well. So Canada's seed regulatory framework requires that most new varieties of agricultural field crops are assessed prior to commercialization. And the first overarching requirement relates to plants with novel traits. Any plant that may be considered to be a plant with a novel trait, no matter its intended
I'm just experiencing a few audio issues. I'm not sure if you're maybe moved away from your microphone a little bit, but if you can just make sure your computer is moved as close to you as possible, that would be great.
Okay, how's that?
That sounds better so far, yeah.
Okay. So I'm just saying that the first and overarching requirement relates to plants with novel traits. And any plant that may be a plant with a novel trait, no matter its intended purpose, is subject to review by the Plant Biosafety Office at CFIA. A second, more limited or restricted requirement relates to variety registration. And crop kinds and types that are set out in Schedule 2 or 3 to the seeds regulations must be registered prior to import or sale in Canada. Now, there are about 54 different crop kinds and types that are subject to variety registration, depending on how you count them. Oilseed soybeans are subject to variety registration, but non-oilseed soybeans or food type soybeans are not. Hemp is not subject to variety registration, but seed can only be sold in Canada if it is pedigreed or certified, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. In the case of hemp seed, it's subject to regulation by by Health Canada, and the licenses that Health Canada issues to cultivate hemp do specify that only pedigreed status seed of a variety on the list of approved cultivars may be planted for hemp production. So that's a Health Canada requirement as opposed to a seeds regulations or CFIA requirement. Now, another consideration when selling seed in Canada relates to the ability to use the variety name when advertising or labeling the seed for sale. Only pedigreed seed, and that means breeder, select, foundation, registered, or certified seed of the major crop kinds can be sold in Canada by variety name. The list of crop kinds is set out in Schedule 2 to the seeds regulations, and there are approximately 80 different crop kinds on that list. You'll note that there are more crop kinds on Schedule 2 than there are subject to variety registration. So there's a number of crop kinds that are not subject to variety registration, but you still can only sell them by variety name if they are a class of certified seed. Now, there's additional information on the use of variety names for both seed and grain provided on the CSGA website at that link that you can see on the screen right now. Okay. Mark, could you just advance the slide, because I seem to have lost the ability to do so. Excellent. Okay. Now, in order to produce pedigreed seed, an individual must be a seed grower and a member of the CSGA. So they have to apply for membership to the CSGA, and they make a separate application for seed crop certification. The seed crop must be inspected by an authorized seed crop inspector, usually a private licensed seed crop inspector, who submits a seed crop inspection report to the CSGA for appraisal by our staff. And provided all of the requirements have been met, the CSGA will certify the crop and issue a seed crop certificate. The harvested seed may be processed by the grower of the seed, but generally seed is processed by a registered seed establishment that is an approved conditioner, and many seed growers are approved conditioners. And if you could advance the slide, Mark, great. Okay, the processed seed must then be sampled by licensed seed samplers and tested by individuals accredited as seed analysts and working in accredited seed labs. The seed is graded based on the seed crop certificate and the seed analysis certificate, and will end up with a designation such as Canada Foundation number 1 or Canada Certified number 1, for example. Official tags are attached to the sealed containers, or when sold in bulk, a bulk pedigreed seed statement is issued for the seed sale. Now, a sealed package, such as what canola is normally sold in, and it can be sold with a Canada pedigree grade name by anyone. So you can find them in many different retail locations across Western Canada, for example. Seed that is sold in bulk, however, must be delivered to the buyer by a registered seed establishment that is registered as a bulk storage facility. Okay, moving on to soybeans. As I mentioned earlier, oilseed soybean varieties are subject to variety registration. An application is made directly to the Variety Registration Office at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and the fee is $875, and CFIA has a service standard of 8 weeks. Non-oilseed varieties of soybeans are not subject to variety registration, but since they can only be sold in Canada by variety names if the seed is certified, variety developers will come to the CSGA and complete an eligibility for certification determination, also known as the Form 300 process. And the fee for that CSGA charges is $500, and our service standard is 3 weeks. Now, just a point, it's not included in the slides, excuse me, but several years ago, the variety registration requirements were changed so that oilseed soybeans are no longer subject to a merit requirement for registration in Canada, and therefore we do not have recommending committees and merit assessment of oilseed soybean varieties anymore. Variety developers can apply directly to the variety registration office with the information required for variety registration, unlike crop kinds such as wheat, oats, or barley, which are still subject to merit requirement and have recommending committees in place to make that assessment. Moving on to hemp. Although it is not subject to variety registration under the Seeds Act and is not listed in Schedule 2, which restricts the use of variety names to pedigreed seed, the industrial hemp regulations administered by Health Canada specify that only pedigreed seed of an approved variety may be used to grow a hemp crop. So, developers of new varieties of hemp will apply to the CSGA for determination of eligibility for certification, Form 300. Once they have that determination from CSGA, they are then in a position to apply to Health Canada to have the variety added to the list of approved cultivars with data from a competent laboratory demonstrating that the plants of the variety meet the hemp definition, meaning that these are cannabis plants with less than 0.3% THC. And just a few examples of some other crop kinds and how they fit in or don't fit into variety registration. Hybrid field corn is not subject to variety registration, and that's been almost 20 years now since it was first exempted from variety registration. But there is a regulation, Section 8 of the Seeds Regulation, that specifies that it can only be sold if it's pedigreed seed. So all of the hybrid field corn seed sold in Canada will be certified seed. Chickpea is not subject to variety registration, but it is listed in Schedule 2, therefore can only be sold by variety name as pedigreed seed. Lentils, oats, and rye are subject to registration if they are grain types, but not if they are being used for green manure or for forage purposes. There are certain fescues, ryegrasses, timothy, and alfalfa are also subject to variety registration if they are forage types intended for pasture and hay production, but not subject to variety registration if intended for turf or land reclamation purposes. So this can sometimes lead to some confusion, especially when varieties are dual purpose and potentially being used for different purposes. So what's not in Schedule 2 or 3? Well, vegetables, herbs, flowers, trees, and shrubs are not subject to variety registration, and you are not restricted to the use of variety names and only have certified seed. A few other examples of some field crops: hemp, as I've mentioned already, camelina and carinata, again, relatively new crop kinds and not that widely grown in Canada yet, but probably because they never got around to changing the regulations. Both of those crop kinds are not listed in Schedule 2 or 3. And Kentucky bluegrass is another example of a crop kind that has not ever been listed in Schedule 2 or 3, so not subject to variety registration, and you can sell common seed by variety name of Kentucky bluegrass. So that's my presentation. Thanks again, Mark, for the invitation to do this today. And if there are any questions about variety registration or pedigreed seed production, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. If you have a question, just type it into the chat box. We'll just do another brief Q&A before we move on to our final speaker of the day. Mike, what role does the addition of dockage by exporters at port present a risk for introducing weed seeds and hence higher trade barrier risks?
Well, you're really getting out of the seed world, which is where I'm more comfortable, Mark, and talking about grain. Obviously, that can be a concern. Generally, that you find that would happen in the grain side, not so much on the seed side. And with seed, they're mostly concerned about cleaning it up as clean as possible to meet relatively strict standards that we have for seed marketing in Canada and the grade standards that we have in Canada. Obviously, if in the grain world, it's a pretty tight margins, and it's pretty important to be able to get a good price for the quality of product that you're selling, and these things do happen. It can lead to difficulties for sure in the importing country, but I can't really say much more than that.
Michelle, I know you're still on the line. Just wondering if you maybe have a little bit of input on that one.
I don't have any specific knowledge to add. I mean, I do think that, you do have the risk of contamination, or you want to try to avoid it, and the amount of effort, the scientific data has to be collected to prove when it's not an issue. So I also don't have the best answer, but I can look into it.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you, Mike, for your time today. We're going to move on to our final speaker of the day. Thanks again for spending your lunch hour with us today. Maryscott Greenwood is the CEO of the Canadian American Business Council based in Washington, D.C. She spent 4 years as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Embassy in Canada, having been offered the diplomatic posting by President Bill Clinton. She now helps companies develop and implement strategies to minimize and mitigate potential damage from disruptive and unexpected events. Maryscott is going to offer us a 10,000-foot view of the USMCA trade deal, what it means, and what the future holds. Maryscott, the floor is yours.
Well, hi. Thank you so much, everybody, and feel free to call me Scotty. It's great to be with you. I haven't had the benefit of being on the call up until this moment, so I hope I don't cover any ground that's already been covered. I will say that my slides are very basic, and I'm not really going to address them exactly, but the reason I included them is a lot of people sort of say, well, what's the difference between the NAFTA, which we have now, and the New Deal, the NAFTA 2.0, or as we call it in the States, USMCA? What are the sort of high-level basic differences? And so that's what my slides will show you. And really, the reason I put them there is because people say, well, does it make any difference? Is it important? And, the position of the Canadian American Business Council is that the New Deal is an improvement. It's a modernization. It's not perfect. But either the NAFTA or the new negotiated deal are far better than no deal at all, no agreement at all, where you're in a world of just tariffs and retaliation and subsidies and things like that. And So we want to avoid here in North America what's happening right at this moment with U.S. and China, which is sort of all out trade and tariff retaliation. But anyway, so my slides kind of show you that. What I thought I would do is talk about kind of up to the moment what's happening, and then how we got here. And then I'm happy to, have any comments or questions. I guess what I would also do right at the top here is do a shameless promotion. If you want to go on the Canadian American Business Council website, you can sign up for a Friday email that I send out every week that talks about sort of what's happening in the Canada-U.S. relationship. It's just a quick hot take, or hit us up on LinkedIn. So there's my shameless promotion. Anyway, where are we? Well, Prime Minister Trudeau and Vice President Pence talked by phone today. I wasn't in on the conversation, but I have to believe that they were talking about the steel and aluminum tariffs. The steel and aluminum tariffs we'll get into in a second, just to sort of set the context. But the steel and aluminum tariffs between Canada, Mexico, and the United States are, I would say, the biggest challenge that we face currently. And I can explain why that is in a minute. But anyway, so Prime Minister Trudeau, Vice President Pence talked today by phone. The Canadian Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is traveling to Washington tomorrow, presumably on the same topic. And then the third sort of bit of recent intel is that Senator Chuck Grassley, who's a really quite influential member of the United States Senate, told reporters in Washington today that he thinks there could be an agreement on the steel and aluminum tariff within 48 hours. He thinks that's a possibility. So why that's important is there's no way to get to ratification in the United States of the new NAFTA unless the United States repeals the steel and aluminum tariff. So how do we get here? And again, just really, really quickly, because you may have talked about it or you lived through it, but the NAFTA is about 30 years old, North American Free Trade Agreement. It was the first trading agreement on earth that actually married modern economies with a developing economy. So it was innovative in that way. So Canada and the United States had already been doing business together for a long time, and actually started in free trade of agricultural equipment and tractors like back in the 50s. So Canada and the United States have been doing business together for a long time. 1965 had the Auto Pact, then had the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. So NAFTA, about 30 years ago, added Mexico into that equation. And, was mostly successful from an economic point of view for all three countries, but there were what economists call dislocations. So certain factories, for example, in the States closed and went to Mexico, and there were other sort of political disruptions. So anyway, fast forward to the most recent presidential election, and candidates in the States have always kind of campaigned against what they consider the bad parts of trade deals. Canada got over this in the 1988 election, I guess, and now Canada is sort of fully free trading regardless of your political party, basically, unless you're NDP. But in the States, it's a hot button. So anyway, everybody knows Trump gets elected. He says NAFTA was the worst deal ever, and he's the best deal maker in the world, and he's going to get a better deal. So lo and behold, we have 13 months of very intense negotiations, which result in a modern agreement that was signed by all three countries at the end of last year. So we have an agreement on paper, and so now where we are is the legislative bodies in all three countries need to approve it if we're going to have it. And so Mexico, just in the last few weeks, has enacted some labor reforms, which they promised to do. Canada, has said that it is ready to ratify the deal as soon as possible, assuming that the steel and aluminum tariffs come off, although Canada is on the clock with its election. We can talk about that if you want. But then, so where the big question is in the United States, and it's because unlike Mexico and Canada, where if you have a majority government, a parliamentary democracy, you can pretty much get what you want. In the U.S., we actually have the opposite. We've got divided government, where Congress, which is of a different party at the moment than the administration, gets an actual say. Like they get to actually vote the thing up or down. And so, because the president loves this deal, and because he brags about this deal a lot, or touts his own horn, toots his own horn, if you will, it makes it harder for Democrats, the opposition, to be for the deal. So the question is, can you get, and the Democrats control the House of Representatives. So if we're going to get this done, you need Democrats and you need them in the next, let's say, several weeks. I think, and I'm more optimistic than a lot of people, we're working on this every day, particularly with Democrats, to get them there. I think that because it's so important for the economy, because there is so much integration between Canada, United States, and Mexico, there is a path for Democrats to vote for this deal. And it won't be because of President Trump, it'll be almost like in spite of him. But I think you could get there, but you can't get there, you can't get to ratification with Democrats or Republicans unless you take off these steel and aluminum tariffs. So I'll just say one more word about steel and aluminum and then I'll pause if that's okay, and we can have a conversation. But so we're chugging along in the negotiations last year between Canada, Mexico, and the United States to get to a new NAFTA. And the president, threatened to pull out of NAFTA, and he called his counterparts in Mexico and Canada all kinds of names. But basically, we're chugging along, negotiating, all the 30-something chapters. And the president at some point felt like he didn't have quite enough leverage. And so he used an unrelated statute in law. He used actually a 1960s era national security statute to levy steel and aluminum tariffs against Mexico and Canada. But his purpose, as he said at the time, was to get leverage at the deal. And so it was not well received, and it wasn't thought that he needed more leverage, but nevertheless he did it. The idea, though, that everybody thought, including people in the White House, was if Mexico and Canada ultimately came to a deal, that sort of that moment you would lift the tariffs, because if you impose them to get leverage, you got what you wanted, or you got a deal that you can live with, then the tariffs should go away. Well, the problem is this president loves tariffs. I don't think that's an overstatement. I mean, he calls himself Tariff Man, and he has convinced himself that tariffs are incremental new money to the U.S. Treasury paid for by foreigners. Very few people understand why he thinks that, because what it really is, when you get down to it, is Americans paying, basically an extra tax for things that they import. So anyhow, the president loves tariffs. So if he lifts the tariffs, he would only lift it for Canada and Mexico. He wouldn't lift them on, for example, all of this, what he's doing with China right now. He wouldn't lift them for other parts of the world where he uses them for negotiations. But because he so badly wants the USMCA, the new NAFTA, to be passed, there is a thought that he would begrudgingly agree to lift the tariffs, because Canada and Mexico and the United States Congress have said that's the only way that you could get this thing done. So that's kind of where we are. The other reason it could be especially relevant to the folks on this webinar and call is the president has also said that, for example, in the case of China, he will use some of the revenues that are collected on the tariffs, with the tariffs, he will use that to help American farmers somehow. And so whether that gets into the seed industry, how that impacts, sort of the North American balance is something that I don't know. I don't think the president has particularly thought it through. But when you start seeing more of a supply managed approach in the United States than they've had in the past, that could potentially, I suppose, have an impact on you. And again, you may have already talked about that, but it seems to me that's sort of the risk if you continue with the tariff retaliation subsidy path that the president's on. I'm optimistic, actually. In spite of everything I just said, I think we can get a deal. I think it's important enough, and there's enough at stake across so many different sectors that I think we can get the new agreement ratified. And there are a lot of people, including us and lots of others, that are working on that kind of round the clock in the States. So with that, why don't I take a breath and see what you think?
That's great, Maryscott. Thank you so much. If you have a question for Maryscott, please type it into the chat box. Maryscott, what is the likelihood that the U.S. Congress will ratify the USMCA trade deal this year?
Right. So I think it's hard to handicap it exactly, but I think if we get resolution of these tariffs, there's a path to ratification. So we could get an announcement on tariffs as soon as this week, and if we do, then it'll be a negotiation between Pelosi and Trump, essentially, the Speaker and the President. And I think the Speaker will ask for kind of one more thing. So the steel and aluminum tariffs are the sort of gate that you have to go through, and then I think Pelosi will ask for maybe progress on an infrastructure bill that the Democrats really like, in return for their support on the trade deal. So I think we can get there. If we don't get it done this year, we really miss the window. In the States, miss it in Canada too, by the way, based on the Canadian election. And then we get into a position where, it's an issue in the 2020 race. And so I think you don't get a new deal until 2021 potentially, which would be, awfully unfortunate from an economic point of view, from a market point of view, and also for, real working families who are trying to, manage their businesses. So that's a long answer. I'd give it better than 50% chance. How's that?
Great. No, thank you so much, Maryscott. Your presentation's been wonderful. I know everybody appreciates your insights. That's actually all the time we have today. So I'd like to thank you, Maryscott, for taking the time to speak with us, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for having me.
And I would just like to thank our sponsors one more time, 2020 Seed Labs, Cantera Seeds, and CCAN for their support. Again, this webinar was recorded and will be available for viewing at germination.ca following the event. Thank you so very much for spending your lunch hour with us. This is Mark Zinkowitz, editor of Germination, signing off.